Okay, good afternoon. My name is Diane Kenney, and my task is to welcome all. Welcome you to an event offered in honor of Marilee Scaff, a woman who constantly celebrated this kind of ongoing education, this kind of inquisitiveness. This welcome goes out to several audiences, to those gathered in Decker, coming in response to various announcements and ads, to those gathered in Pitzer, also on the Pilgrim Place campus, to those picking it up in their residences from the Pilgrim Place Zoom link, and finally to those who will receive it later in recorded form from the Pilgrim Place and the Claremont UCC web. My thanks and welcome to David Vásquez-Levy, president of the Pacific School of Religion, the presenter this afternoon. And as always, our gratitude to those residents of Pilgrim Place who volunteer for sights and sounds, making possible all of this connectivity. Our process, there will, of course, be a Q&A after the presentation. Since the complete event will be recorded, we make the same pitch every time. Please wait till a microphone gets to you before you start asking your question. And Jean Boutilier will be the one person who has chosen to be the mic runner. So your questions are more than welcome, prepare them, but please wait for Jean. Now, Jean, we'd appreciate a few words from you about that wonder we honor today, Marilee.
Diane announced that this lecture is honoring Marilee Scaff, PhD, who lived in this community and was a leader in Claremont for much of her 103 years. The little committee that was organizing this presentation chose to honor her. Maybe a series will develop in her name. Over the years, our Claremont and Pilgrim Place community has been blessed by many, many inspiring people whose enduring legacies helped to shape our community's passions for peace and justice, for repair of the earth, for care of each other, for inclusion. Among them, we recognize Marilee's intellect and her energy, and her promotion of local and national and international community, civic improvement and education and democracy. And this fits very well with David's prophetic call today to act wisely in dealing with the polycrises we face today. If you're in Pitzer and did not get a copy of the leaflet when you came in, it's on top of the piano.
My name is Eleanor Scott Myers, and I'm a resident. Well, hello. An old friend. Kisses allowed here all the time. I'm a resident at Pilgrim Place for the last 18 years, and it is my honor to introduce the president of Pacific School of Religion from Berkeley, California, Dr. David Vásquez-Levy, and invite him to speak to and with us about things that are of great consequence in the lives of so many in our country and around the world at this time. President Vásquez-Levy is a person of the world. He grew up in Guatemala, the home of his Guatemalan father and his Jewish mother. David's wife is from a Finnish immigrant family in Minnesota, and they raised their children in Ethiopia. Now, by now, you are gaining an understanding of why issues of migration and immigration, the movements of people around us in California, as well as across our nation and world, carry special significance for this person. I share with you this bit of David's background because I want you to see him as a uniquely talented leader that he is, not only as a visionary leader in theological education, but within many kinds of faith-based and religious communities, as well as within the world of national policy development here in the United States, as he has been a speaker in the congressional briefings and immigration consultations held in both the Obama and the Biden White House. And he has done work with several state attorneys across the country to help reframe our national conversation about immigration. In today's challenging times, as lives everywhere appear to be on the move, we must watch and listen, lest we lose track of what is happening in our cities, our state, our nation. And my friends, if we ever did, we certainly do not have the luxury today to lose track or turn away from learning to think ever more clearly that we might be prepared to take action related to critical undercurrents present today here in the United States. David, this mic is now yours. Speak to us of what you know and have learned, from where you have been, what you have seen and heard, that together we might gain greater insight for facing the days ahead. Provoke us. We will listen, and afterwards we will ask questions as we seek even deeper clarity from amid your words of wisdom for us today. Thank you for being with us.
Jean and Diane, such a great pleasure to be with you. As I get started, let me just say a little bit about the context where we're coming from, and I want to invite my colleague Michelle Estrellado to share a little bit about herself as well. She's here with me for this couple of days. She'll be available afterwards as well. So Michelle, you want to?
Good afternoon, everyone. That's a really hard introduction to follow up. So, yeah, my name is Michelle Estrellado. Oh, I'm sorry. Here we go. My name is, I think this is actually taller than I am, so. My name is Michelle Estrellado, and I'm a newish part of Pacific School of Religion. I'm the current director of development. I've actually am a local here in Southern California. So I live here in Los Angeles in Woodland Hills. I have a 19-year-old son that just started at Cal State Fullerton, so I do frequent this area. I have a younger daughter. She's 16, and she is attending Oaks Christian in Westlake Village. She's a junior there, so I have a year and a half more until she's done. I come from 16 years experience in higher education. I worked for a visual art and culinary program in North Hollywood. My last position there was I was Dean of Students. And at the same time, I took a little pause too in between until I found PSR. Actually, PSR probably found me. And it's been really great. Really knowing about the institution and being part of this wonderful institution. My children has always gone to schools and faith-based institution, so it's just a really nice step for me to be working for this organization. And I think that's all for me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Keep it brief.
I wanted you to have a chance to meet, I'm going to turn the other mic on, Michelle, in part, so that one of my asks of you is tell her stories of the importance of Pacific School of Religion, if you're connected to it, of theological education more broadly. She'll be around, and as she comes into this work with us, to be able to know and understand the significance of our work together and to share with you the ways in which we are seeking to live that out today. I'm very honored to be here today and a little intimidated, you know? So first I'm introduced by Eleanor, who preceded me as president at Pacific School of Religion, and folks who have been doing this work for many, many years, Diane and Jean and others here. I walk across and I see David Napier Hall across the way, who was another president of Pacific School of Religion. And there's no building's name in my name yet. So we'll fundraise for that today at the end of this. But it's really also, this was the place where Bill Lesher, who was president of the Lutheran School of Theology of Chicago when I went to school there, lived the last part of his life here, and this was a really dear community for him. This was the place where I got to see him for the last time before he passed away, having had such an impact in my own life as president of the school where I attended. I've already been introduced enough. There's plenty of other things that I could say. Let me just tell you, my family is connected by love and coffee. And that's the thing you want to remember as Eleanor introduced me. Guatemala has the best coffee in the world. Okay, we're done. That's it. Finns, my wife's background is Finnish, drink the most coffee per capita in the world. And my kids are from Ethiopia originally, and that's really the origin of coffee. So, but seriously, that experience and that reality does shape my understanding of the world. One side of my family has been displaced throughout the history of Jewish communities, going back generations. It is pretty difficult to track most of our family, as I grew up with my grandmother near my house, going to Shabbat services and to Shabbat dinners at her home. She would never talk about the past, in part because it had been so painful and disruptive in her own life. And being able to track generations and put together the story of our family on that side of the family was always very complex, as it is today, to discuss the realities of a region of the world that continues to express many of the issues we face with as individuals and as societies. There's a particularity to a region of the world that holds so much of our hopes and so much of our disappointments. On my dad's side of the family, my family is a product of mestizaje, so I'm a Guatemalan mutt. Pretty much everything about me is virtually made up of all kinds of elements and parts of the world. If I were to show you, if I did my DNA test, in part to sort of verify if any of the stories I've been told are actually true, because they're somewhat confusing and a little expensive. And so in one of the DNA tests that I did, it actually gives you a map of the world that sort of puts, where your ancestry is from. It pretty much covers most of the world. The largest portion of my DNA is native Guatemalan and native communities in Central America. The second one is Jewish, and the third is just a smattering of everything else. So who I am, my ancestors that claim me, shape the way I think about the world and what I'd like to share today. So does the place where I am. I am coming here as president of Pacific School of Religion, a place that many of you know, many of you are alums, have been connected to the school, have taught at PSR, have helped to shape it or contribute to the work of PSR. You know well the importance of theological education in the world, as well as the challenges being faced by the need to prepare leaders for faith communities in the world that are rooted and they have an expansive view of both Christianity and social change. Let me just ground our conversation a little bit with this brief video that just introduces, if you're not familiar with PSR, a little bit of the core of how, again, what shapes my understanding and the way I view the work that we will engage today.
There's a drive.
It's been with us from the beginning.
To discover agency in ourselves
and to awaken it in others.
To push the boundaries
of inclusion.
And to expand the definition of grace.
It's a drive grounded in faith,
courage,
and purpose.
It's what compels us
to take on
the challenges of this new era with everything we are.
Everything we are.
We are PSR. Unafraid since 1866.
The work of Pacific School of Religion began in 1866, at a time marked by 18 months following the Civil War, when the nation was deeply divided. In the aftermath of the discovery of gold in Sutter Mill, that brought people from everywhere around the world to create what the Alameda County Record called the most heterogeneous mass of humanity ever assembled since the confusion of tongues. And at a time when the cross-continental railroad was completed, connecting people from east to west and making a trip that had been a matter of weeks into a matter, or rather months, into a matter of days. Today we live at a time similarly marked by deep division. By some accounts, we are as divided in this nation as we were at the end of the Civil War. What is bringing people to the Bay Area is not gold, but silicon. And we are assembling around the world a great awareness of the diversity. And we are connected not by a golden spike that finished that train track across the country, but by the touch of a screen in the way that was just described. In this room, to rooms across this place, and around. We are living through a time in which we are playing with things like the theory of relativity. See, in Einstein's theory of relativity, there are two grounding things that orient our experience of reality: time and space. And both of those things are being messed with right now. Because when I say, dearly beloved, we are gathered here, that may mean here in the space or anywhere around and across, whatever somebody has access to this video recording. When I say now, it may mean now, here, exactly, at this moment, or now whenever you happen to watch this later or somebody else does. So there are ways in which we are living at a time of great disruption to the ways we think about our world. And yet it is helpful to be in this conversation at a place like Pilgrim Place, where we know that things we are living with are things that are similar to things we have lived with previously. One of my other predecessors at PSR, John Knox McLean, delivered a speech in 1884 to the PSR faculty and board with these words: "The new century," now he's looking at the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, "the new century promises to disclose events and conditions in society of a widely revolutionary character. What ought to be the attitude and function of a theological seminary at such a time? It ought to crave for itself due share in shaping the new order of things." At that time, PSR was not a place with a 150-year history and a large number of alums who had demonstrated the impact of the school. It was basically a ragtag team of people that had been trying to educate women and people for ministry, and were beginning to realize the importance of a commitment to Asian and Asian Pacific Islanders as the nation's fervor against Asians, and particularly Chinese descent people, was rising. And yet, to have the courage to think what ought to be the place that we claim to have. What should our function be? How should we think of the role of theological education, of the role of faith communities, of engaging educational institutions? We are living through a time that has many of the same markings of previous times that we have done. The topic that we are discussing today puts together polycrisis, where I'll say a little bit more about if you're not familiar with the term, although I think it speaks for itself and probably resonates for you, and Christian nationalism. There is plenty of writing right now on Christian nationalism. So I don't pretend in the next minutes that we have together and in our conversation to be the expert on Christian nationalism or to try to give you everything there is to say about it. Much is being written. A lot of documentaries are coming out because of the critical importance of discussing the rise of Christian nationalism and other nationalisms more broadly. But we know, whether it is by watching the news or recognizing what is happening, that there is a problematic alliance that's happening between our understanding of nation and religion. It is not unique to the United States, but it is getting a particularly pronounced reality again. What's important to recognize is that that pronounced reality has been in the making for a long time, and it has been a part of our national identity for a very long time. But whether you look at the rise of Hindu nationalism in India, of Jewish nationalism in Israel, of Muslim nationalism in some parts of the Islamic world, there is a growing alignment of extreme forces around religious identities. Some of this has its origins in the concept of both the phrases of Christian or religious and then nationalism. So let me talk about those two words for a little bit. This is a very simplistic idea about the development of monotheistic traditions. In many of our understandings of the development of the world, we think of it as a linear progression. So within some Christian communities, the assumption is that there were the polytheists, right? There were the people who just believed in everything, and then we all began to become monotheistic, and then there is a linear progression from that to development of our ideas and the improvement of the world. I grew up in Guatemala in the middle of a civil war that pitted together two worldviews, supposedly, capitalism and communism. In reality, it would align all kinds of things with these two forces. Growing up, the rejection had to be of Catholic backwards ideas with idols and gods, and instead we should align ourselves with capitalism and the United States and Protestantism. Because clearly the United States was doing better than the rest of the world because of their Christian Protestant identity. So this idea of the world being linear in its progression and inevitably leading to other ways of being becomes deeply problematic in terms of the development of a religious understanding and identity. A way to think about this is that I happen to live in Berkeley, and it's interesting to me that the assumption in the world is that humans will increasingly become secular humanists. That it's just part of that same linear progression from kind of believing in all kinds of crazy things of the gods, to the single God, and then eventually to getting rid of that one God. Behind this assumption is that the divine, or God, is simply humans' way of dealing with that which they do not understand. So as the things that we do not understand ebb away, then our need for the divine, for God, and for religion ebbs away. Now, that's perfectly okay as a way of thinking about the world. It's problematic when it becomes dominant, or the assumption that that is what ought to happen, because it results in the rejection of the beliefs and convictions of lots of people in the world, and oftentimes then gives rise to anger, frustration, and fear in response to that idea. A more persistent element or problematic element without that development of an idea is that then it leads to a certain way of being human that is better than any other. Are you hearing white supremacy behind this, right? The assumption that there is a better way to be human. Now, what I want us to start thinking about as I introduce this is that it's easy to think of Christian nationalism when we look at images of MAGA and Trump and that. But we need to realize that the elements of Christian nationalism are also embedded within many progressive ideas that assume that there is a better way to become human, and it just happens to align with the beliefs of people in progressive coastal cities. It just happens to be that way. So some of our thinking around religion and its role in the world have been shaped, as many of you know, certainly from the papal bull Inter Caetera, or that's often referred to as the doctrine of discovery. This was a Pope Alexander VI, after Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1942 and discovered America, that the Pope then did this edict, right, or this papal bull, stating the following: the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. In a course that my wife and I taught in Ghana on Christianity and the slave trade, we begin the course by saying that the cross and the sword arrived in Africa as it did in Latin America on the same ship. So Christian nationalism is deeply embedded both in our concepts of religion, of superseding traditions that become better and better than others, and in our developing ideas of nation states that have the power and the merging of these two things together in deeply problematic ways. In his book, The Rise of the Nation State in Europe, Schwarzwald identifies this development of the concept of the nation state as the accumulation of power, of the rejection of certain ideas that were much more multiple in either feudal states and communities that were tied to single individuals, to begin to tie larger groups and regions and powers and assets around a particular identity. And that these systems require certain ways of bonding to each other. So the development of border ideas, of common languages and religious languages began to form. In the United States, both the legacy of nation states, we get to escape and come to Pilgrim Place, and identify a way, and I mean Pilgrim Place as the pilgrims come into the United States and identify in this place. The perception was that this would be a place where we could create a nation that would have freedom. Yet within the very formation of the United States was this deep sense about this, the elements of what were the doctrine of discovery. They were captured in the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was primarily just a very boring statement that President Monroe was reading to the Congress, but that became quite significant and kept getting repeatedly referred to and utilized to excuse the expansion of the United States as a nation state that would, as the Spanish state had tried to do previously, bring goodness and well-being to the rest of the world in exchange for whatever was under their feet. So the Monroe Doctrine basically began by saying to Europe, you stay away, we will have control over this region in the world of the Western Hemisphere. And Europe will stay over there, and we will control this side, and then relieve all of the other people in the Western expansion of all of their darkness, all of their backwardness, and bring to them both religion, Christianity, a particular version of it, Protestant Christianity, and then, of course, the benefits of the nation state that we might bring to them. Today, we are seeing a rise of these two understandings of bonded, enclosed environments and equating nations and states and around religious identity becomes one of the ways to claim that boundary and to seal it. In this book on The Age of Walls by Tim Marshall highlights that when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, there were a total of 17 walls in the world that divided nation states. Literal walls that were built. Most borders in the world do not have walls. This is not a normal thing. But in 1989, when the Berlin Wall, which is the one that lives the largest often in our imagination, there were only 17 of them in the world. Today there are over 90 walls that divide nation states, including the wall in Israel and Palestine, the wall that continues to be argued over and built in the southern United States, and many others that divide deeply nations, that are embodiments of this fear of creating a seal, impermeable boundary between us and them. Some of these rises, so we have a long history of doing this. It is a very human tendency to want to set boundaries and to identify them. It takes sometimes religious traditions and challenging of our ideas, while some religious impulses can lead to separation and to bonding within a community. Within most religious traditions, there is also a call for looking beyond ourselves. In the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, it is one of the most repeated commandments to welcome the stranger because you were a stranger in the land. So the intent of many religious traditions is to push us outside of that fear, of that desire to be on our own. At different periods of time, why did we go from 17 walls to over 90? It's because of the rising anxiety that people are living with and the inability to figure out what to do about it. That is, either to protect themselves, their children, their assets, their well-being. Imagine the number of walls that have risen around our living communities all over the United States. In the land of the free and the brave, we incarcerate more people than any other nation, and we are building walls around all of our communities in ways that are really deeply troubling, but that we have very easily become comfortable with. Those walls are intended to protect the things that we value against whatever threats may be outside. We are living in many ways in which some of you may be familiar with this common term that now seems kind of quaint from the 1980s. Came out of military analysis of the future, that we were entering a VUCA world, a world where we are filled with volatility, with uncertainty, with complexity, and with ambiguity. That these four forces are undermining our ability to project what the world would look like, what might happen, that the level of complexity we are trying to understand is overwhelming our capacity to understand the world around us, that our fear is being created by the volatility of markets, the constant repetition of how much change and uncertainty we see. We are living it through our organizations, our institutions, our educational institutions, certainly in our democracy. So we are living through a time that is stirring for us a fear, an uncertainty, and so human desire, appropriately so, safety, security, a little bit of more focus for ourselves. The question is, how do we pursue that? What should the function of religious and conviction systems be when we are dealing with a moment of such uncertainty? Well, a lot of this is the bad news, and you probably know most of it. I want us to think about that role. What ought to be the function that we will have as we foresee a century ahead that is definitely going to be filled with a lot of uncertainty and transitions? I'm a preacher. I'm a homiletician. That's my field. And because of that, I pay attention to what stories are doing in a time like this.
In the multiverse, you can live up to your ultimate potential.
What's happening?
You discovered a way to temporarily link your consciousness to another version of yourself. Accessing all of the memories and skills. It's called verse jumping. There's a great evil spreading throughout the many verses. And you may be your only chance of stopping it.
It's crazy. You're starting to get it.
How many of you have seen Everything, Everywhere, All at Once? All right, so I encourage you to look at this. So the last title said the best multiverse movie out there. Why? Because there's a lot of multiverse movies. Spider-Man in multiverse, we got lots of multiverses going on. Stories, humans are spending more resources today in capturing and telling stories than we have almost any time in our human history. My mother in Guatemala watches telenovelas from Korea, Turkey, Spain, South America, because we have access through streaming to stories from all over the world. And because of that, we are becoming aware that there is not a simple reality, a bonded reality that must have a single way of understanding the world, that we actually need to find ways to recognize that we live in many realities at the same time. As we sit here in the warmth of the space, with a company that we like, with educated people, at the same time we are aware that down the street, just on the other side of Highway 10, the neighborhood changes radically about who lives there. And it's not that far, but we can live most of our life with no awareness of it, with no awareness of the communities that are around us. What we are being impressed with is the ability to hold all these multiverse realities together at the same time. And because of that, we feel threatened and uncertain, and then we respond by trying to create boundaries, ideological boundaries, whether there's a polarization of only discussing things with those with whom we might agree. As I was introducing folks, and I don't know, Michelle, if you remember this, I don't know that I said this when we were interviewing you, but I said, in polite company, you don't talk about sex, religion, and politics. At Pacific School of Religion, we're fixated with all three. So we are constantly talking about all of these things. The homework for people who go to Davos comes in the form of reports from the World Economic Forum. So this is their assignment, in their syllabus before they all show up for Davos, or at least whoever shows up, whoever their assistants are, read them. So is the Global Risks Report. Is one of the ones that they issue every year before Davos comes together. It's free and available online. Again, it's a very interesting read to understand how the world's most powerful nations are evaluating and understanding the reality of the world and what lies ahead. The report begins by saying, as 2023 begins, the world is facing a set of risks that feels both wholly new and eerily familiar. We have been through this before. We have been through periods of time as institutions, as a nation, as humans, through periods of disruption before. There are some particularities to the ones that we are facing now that feel like they are overwhelming our capacity to deal with them. They are pressing our ability, and so we're telling lots of stories to try to make sense of them. The persistence of these crises is already reshaping the world that we live in, ushering in economic and technological fragmentation. So this is the risk. Whether it's the formation of nation states, boundaries, or the tighter boundaries of religious traditions, what it can lead to is fragmentation. You see that image powerfully in that multiverse movie, right? All of a sudden it's like, the world breaks into their own little cubby holes. A continued push for national resilience, so this is a good thing, we want nations to be resilient, but a continual push for national resilience in strategic sectors will come at a cost, one that only few economies can bear. Basically, if everybody goes home with their own toys and invests only in this resilience of their own nations, what will happen is that very few nations will be able to afford the solutions to threats, military threats, to, we're seeing this in Europe right now, or to threats of technology and piracy. Geopolitical dynamics are also creating significant headwinds for global cooperation, which often acts as a guardrail to these global risks. This is a year and a half ago, at the very beginning of the war in Ukraine, even before some of the issues that have happened since. Now, how do we then deal with the understandable fear we are living with? In our bodies, we feel it. We feel it in our families. We feel it in our social structures and in our communities, in our churches, in our institutions, in our democracy. How do we find strength to respond to these? There's some challenging words. You told me to provoke. I'll do my best here from the voices of others. And I want to introduce the voices of 4 people in this, or 5 of them in this process as I conclude my remarks. The first one is from My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. Again, another phenomenal read right now. The deadliest manifestation of white fragility is its reflexive confusion of fear with danger and comfort with safety. Do you hear that? It's very powerful, right? So just because I am, just because I am afraid, it doesn't mean I am in danger. I might not know you, and when I drive by your neighborhood, I may feel afraid. It doesn't necessarily actually mean that I am in danger. I am confusing what my body is doing to what's unfamiliar and making assumptions about what it means. And comfort with safety. So what do I do when I feel afraid? I seek comfort. I seek a way to feel with what's familiar, to surround myself by the things that will provide me with comfort. Comfort comes at a great cost. At commencement in May, this is the second voice for right now, our academic dean, Susan Abraham, gave the valedictorian charge. This is at the end of commencement when we give the charge to students as they move into the world as graduates. And she spoke about Christian nationalism and what she called Christian capitalism. So I'll read her quote. We are caught in a confusing web of individualist rhetoric, spurred on by what I am calling Christian capitalism on the one hand, and on the other, Christian nationalism, an obscene and idolatrous narrative of collectivity which uses the name of religion to shore up a racist and virulent power structure. You can get this on our website. You can read through it. I'm puzzled over the whole thing. It's a little dense. But think about what it's saying. Basically, in our desire for comfort, we are doing this idolatrous equation of the nation with our comfort, with our protection. Neither of these are conducive to the strategic solidarities that we urgently need. So whether it is Davos and the World Economic Forum or Susan Abraham at PSR, the call is to resist the power of fragmentation and to find ways to make connections, to seek the solidarities that we need. The critique I want us to engage with, where it's provocative, is that it's easy to see this in blaming those rallies that are taking place, the taking over or attempt to take over the Capitol. Those things should get our attention. But so should the ways we are seeking comfort in our own communities, and the ways that even identity politics is fragmenting the communities within progressive movements that undermine us. We do need to do work to convince those across the aisle, but we have a lot of work to do within our own communities of progressive movements. Susan goes on to say, that form of individualism, however, needs a mythical container. This is where the idea comes of Christian nationalism, a narrative of superiority and power, a narrative of the greatest nation on earth that seems to assure each of us that these 5 C's, I'll talk about the 5 C's in a second, are guaranteed to us as a birthright. So this is where it hurts, right? That we have certain assumptions, that we live in the greatest nation on earth. This is what's behind Christian nationalism, and we have the right to these 5 C's: to comfort, to convenience, to choice, to competition, and the circus. Constant entertainment. And these are all extractive. They're also anesthetizing. They tend to prevent us from paying attention to what's going on in the world and around us. What she is calling us to think about is, what is the price of these various things? What is the price of our comfort? What is the price of the convenience that we have? Especially as it has been seriously exacerbated by great developments like Amazon Prime. One of the things that capitalism does at its best is to separate labor from capital, right? And the capital then becomes the way to hide the cost of labor. So we can convince ourselves that we can seal the border and still eat, which is absurd. We simply cannot. We can't drive vehicles. We can hardly do anything if we seal the border. But a system that has allowed us to prioritize our own narrative about ourselves as a nation, both certainly to one extreme in parts of the political spectrum, but across all of it. Earlier this morning, I ended my sermon at Claremont, UCC, with this quote from another voice I encourage us to listen to. This is The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. And as I mentioned this morning, for those of you who were there, she wrote this book in 1993, but the book is a futurist, dystopic sense of the future. She's considered one of the mothers of Afrofuturism. And in her book, which starts in 2024, so it's set in this very futuristic moment of 2024, starts in August, actually. The book begins in August of 2024. So I read this book 20 years ago. I didn't get it. I didn't get it. Now, reading it in 2024, I am just like, I'm reading it through right now with a group, a dinner group. But this is what the very first sentence of the book says. Prodigy is, at its essence, adaptability and persistence, positive obsession. We need prodigy. We need to find ways to be creative in this moment of response. And what it takes is both adaptability, being able to manage all the changes around it, be adaptive to it, and persistence. Without persistence, what remains is an enthusiasm of the moment. This morning I said that I think this is a good summary of our polarization politically. On the left, we have the enthusiasm of the moment. We'll all be out there when Black Lives Matter for that month, and then we'll be done. And we're not going to be out on the streets. And then, on the other hand, without adaptability, a refusal to see change, but rather to want to make whatever it is great again, theological education great again, let's make the church great again, whatever it is. What remains may be channeled into a destructive fanaticism. A new generation finds itself caught between these two offers, either of just whatever the spur of the moment excitement is, or the unwillingness to change and a fanaticism. And so that leads to a complete disengagement. This community here at Pilgrim Place embodies the idea of what it means to have a positive obsession, to engage ourselves fully, persistently in the work that we do. It is critical that we do this with consideration both for nation, democracy, social networks, but also, in my view, perhaps because I happen to be at a seminary, but I think it's more than that, we must also do that with an attention to the religion part of these movements of Christian nationalism. In 2016, most of the candidates that were running for president of the Democratic side that were the front runners actually go to church. But none of them spoke all that much about their faith and their religion. So the one holding the Bible is Trump, the one who doesn't really give a damn about it, but who knows the importance of taking people's faith seriously, or at least pandering to it. So we must be ones who are willing to engage the religious part of Christian nationalism critically, but also appreciatively. Because, I don't think it's only because I am at a seminary, but because, my favorite source is the World Economic Forum, the best wisdom on all things religious. So the World Economic Forum estimates that by 2050, the religious population of the world will have grown 23 times faster than the non-religious population of the world. Now, sit with that for a bit. See, I'm in Berkeley, and this sounds ridiculous. Because in Berkeley, it sounds like religion will be out the door in no time, we just have to wait it out. But if religious nationalisms mean anything, is that religion isn't going anywhere. that human conviction isn't going anywhere. That all it takes is an invisible bug that all of a sudden brings an entire world to its knees to understand that we do not understand everything that there is. That even if we limit the role of the divine, however we understand it, to that which we do not understand, there's still room in the universe for a divine, even if it's defined that narrowly. That it is the height of our idolatry to believe that everything should be reduced to that which we understand and can control. This is hard work. As we gather here today, we honor the memory of Marilee Scaff. I did not get a chance to meet her, but I've loved the opportunity in this last couple of days to sit with her story. In an interview with the Courier, she reminded us of this. I learned very early on, my understanding is she was at the time of her death the longest living Girl Scout. I learned very early on that it takes a lot of hard work to get something accomplished. If you expect it to be easy, you'll be disappointed. It will take a lot of work. So what kind of work will it take? Another great artist, or another great scholar to read right now is Adrienne Marie Brown and her book Emergent Strategy. I think it is healing behavior to look at something so broken and see the possibility and wholeness in it. In the Christian tradition right now, we are in this bizarre season of Lent that tries to invite people to think about weird things like giving up meat, which now we call by other names like vegetarian and others, because we're coming to understand, like the ancient ones, giving up some things in order to understand other things may be valuable. So how do we look at the brokenness of the world and think that within it is a possibility of life, of wholeness? Patrick Reyes, who sits on our board of trustees at PSR, he's now the dean at Auburn Seminary, wrote a book called The Purpose Gap, which talks about the failure of educational systems to really serve the populations more broadly and challenges us to think about ways in which our systems that have a history of colonial, let's focus the resources on a few, and then by exclusion decide who's excellent. He says closing the purpose gap means removing the barriers, generating the resources, building the power. We got to get comfortable with power, and imagining the future where those who are the most marginalized thrive. I sit with this question regularly still today, and so there's our work as we try to do it at PSR. What ought to be the attitude and function of a theological seminary at such a time? Fill in for theological seminary, what ought to be the function of Pilgrim Place, of Claremont UCC, of whatever organization you are a part of this community? For us at PSR, it ought to bring transformative leadership preparation within the reach of an emerging, diverse generation. Where those communities thrive, all of us will thrive. It ought to resource a faculty who raise collective voices of change, not just the great ideas that we have, but to see ourselves as catalysts that can raise the voices of an emerging generation that is creative, imaginative, and incredibly driven. To build a global network of spiritually rooted change makers. If the challenge is that we have failed projects of globalization because we've done them in extractive ways, what are the alternative ways of creating a global society, given the level of technology that allows us access to the stories of people all over the world and to connect with them? We certainly ought to shape a new discourse, a new public discourse on religion, gender, and sexuality, so that we can safeguard the progress that we have made to full inclusion, but also so that we can speak more broadly about what those who have lived in the in-between of identities can teach us to queer all the binaries and borders that tend to diminish our capacity for collaboration. And we ought to reimagine the spaces we occupy. At PSR, this is about the physical and virtual spaces we occupy around a diverse, intergenerational, and cross-disciplinary community. This is the work, I think, that lies ahead for us as a theological institution. But I think it's in many ways work that we are all to do together within the context in which we are. For us, this work is done never alone, but in community. This is a picture of my faculty, who I'm constantly remembering our work of our faculty and their conversations, to think about how we together can reshape our understanding of the world. Who is your team of folks that when you think about the overwhelming challenges that are before us, that you align with, that you support, that you find a way to encourage one another in the journey that is before us? So, thank you for your attention, and hopefully this helps to enlighten a little bit of our conversation. Welcome your questions.
No, this is really encouraging. One of the trends I see in the academy, though, is a tilt towards science rather than religion. There are more money being invested in scientific schools than there are in theology schools. Can you see some way to turn around that trend?
Definitely. So first of all, yes, indeed, right? It's not just in education, right? In many things, we invest a lot more resources in technology and in things that we think will lead to resources and funding. We have to challenge that reality happening in higher education, a level of commoditization of education. But because I tend to focus on the places where I'm most involved, so I'm most involved in the humanities side, I have to say that we have spent way too much time as the humanities resisting the calls to make a case for the hope that is within us, to use First Peter's words. We have assumed that the value of education, and of liberal arts education in particular, is a given, and that people understand it, and that any requirement to explain it to others and to demonstrate its value, how it's accomplished, we convince ourselves that what we have to do is so complex, so unique, that nobody could understand it, and so it requires massive amounts of resources to do it, and we do not need to justify how that improves people's lives or changes it. As I'm doing my work in theological education, one of the key commitments for us is to diversify that education. I cannot do that without demonstrating that this education will actually emancipate people, liberate them, which includes their ability to earn an income. So I think part of what we have to do is to challenge what's happening in the assumptions and the letting go of the humanities and the lack of understanding of it. But on the humanities side, we need to make a better case, consistently and in terms that the rest of the society can understand, without dismissing the calls for demonstrating education's value in that way. The higher education system in the United States is a colonial system. It was designed to educate a small group of people who would then trickle down the education to the rest of the masses. It's crashing under the weight of its inability to educate a much larger part of the population. So I'll give you a perfect example. Every fall, when students go to college, only 13% of US first-year students go to a residential college. Only 13%. But in all of our collective imagination, that's the college experience. You get in the van and you go off to a residential community. 87% of freshmen this fall will begin college in a different way, at a community college in another place. So how do we change our understanding as to where education is taking place? If we continue to simply pour more resources into the tiny set of institutions that are not growing in their acceptance, but rather diminishing the percentage of people they accept, we are going to continue to be challenged about the value of the education that we give.
On a different topic, when you were talking about Sally Timmel, Pilgrim Place, on a different topic, when you were talking about walls, I was thinking about also territories as you well know, from Gaza to Ukraine to Tigray province in Ethiopia, where I lived, by the way, that isn't, there's something around the male need for territory, and you didn't talk about feminist thinking, and I noticed that in your faculty it's 8 men to 4 women. So I'm wondering, what in the hell you're doing about feminist thinking?
Amen. Indeed. Yep. I think, that the need for feminist understandings to be continued in the critical work that began and has been perceived as either done or accomplished, right? The work around women's roles in leadership in congregations and in communities is massively under resourced. It is hugely under attended to in terms of paying attention to what people and what women are leading us into. So I'll accept the challenge to diversify the faculty more in that regard as a key part of the work that needs to be done. It's interesting because when you look at our faculty and our staff, the majority of our community is women. It is in the faculty where the inequality is. Our board is majority women. Both the chair and vice chair of the board are women. And so they shape the way we do our institutional life. But that is a place for continued growth. So thank you. Yes, yeah, it is the shaping of our institution. Of course, part of it has been to change the idea as to who teaches, right? Because the divisions between understandings of faculty and staff are also needing to change about how we understand who does the teaching of our students and in what settings and in what ways.
David, you quoted and showed a slide of John Knox McLean saying, shaping the new order of things. And unfortunately, as I sit here, that's exactly what I know is going on in everything from Supreme Court decisions. I need some very specific marching orders. How do I live up to that statement while exactly the same thing is going on in areas that do not meet my understanding of what good life is?
Yeah. Parker Palmer, in his book, The Heart of Democracy, talks about, there has a statement where he says, democracy ought to be inhabited. So the marching orders are, we ought to get pretty practical about who's getting elected, as we know already, into not just November election of the president, but who's getting elected into school boards, into communities. What are we doing to, of course, we don't have to worry about registering people in California, because of course they'll vote Democrat, right? Enough of them. But how much are we doing to, again, walk across the highway to figure out what in those communities that do not necessarily see that the government has their best interests at heart, regardless of who's in power. One of the reasons that there's a disengagement, there's been this expectation, let me talk about Latino populations for a little bit. There's a rise of Latino population that is moving towards Christian nationalism, in part because, at least in rhetoric, even if not in reality, the Republicans are talking about finances, they're talking about economic mobility. We are talking about it in ways that by the time we're done saying it, nobody's too sure what we said. So we need to find ways to speak about the issues that individuals we are seeking to partner with care about. So inhabit democracy. Find ways to engage people, not just within our own communities, but across differences. Inhabit those democracies within our educational institutions, within our religious communities, to find ways that we understand and look around and see who's leading in our communities. What does the diversity of those communities look like? This is hard work, because so much of our society is segmented by race, by age, by educational levels. So it's going to require, if nothing else, let's queer the binaries. Let's queer the boundaries that have been so set to keep us apart from one another. You can also become a, supporter of PSR. Oh. Which you do. So. Other questions? Yeah, I don't think, is anybody planning to go to seminary soon? Come join us. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a rich experience.
Thank you, thank you.
You could do a little outreach and tell people that they could come to the website of Claremont UCC in a few hours, or to our own Vimeo site at Pilgrim Place and see a recording of this. You can link it to other people. You can pass it on. This is good news in a series of bad news situations where we could do some work together, led by this very helpful seminary and this wonderful preacher. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.